Good little capitalist.
All right, we're recording.
Yeah. Okay, so actually, all right, yeah. So the topic is basically nominalism versus idealism and the ontology of concepts. Perhaps with a specific focus on numbers, since those are like sort of the most interesting example of this kind of thing. So maybe do we want to start out with just like giving a short description of our own initial positions?
Sure.
Uh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
you go ahead first.
yeah, Goffin, you go first because you're probably going to be the odd one out for
All
this.
right.
Maybe.
I think that numbers. So it depends on your definition of exist. Numbers don't exist in the universe, like physically, obviously. I think, however, that there is no distinction between invent and discover. When we invent something, the only difference is we're pulling it from a much larger pool of possible designs. And so it's kind of like a gradation. There's some things that are obviously invented, like, for example, the light bulb, and there's some things that are obviously discovered, like pi. We didn't. It's just a matter of like how many options there were to choose from. How much creativity did we have to use in picking them out? So like that's why we say that we discovered the laws of physics. We didn't invent them because there was only one possible option. Whereas for uh, like stuff like telephones and CPUs, there are many possible options that we could have chosen. Many creative decisions we could make, and so that's why we say invented. But there's no fundamental difference. It's just along a sliding spectrum. Like for example, should software patents be like should software algorithms be discovered or should they be considered invented? Kind of a little bit of both. And so in that sense, um, yeah, I think that numbers definitely are very close to the discovered part of the scale. But I don't think they really exist physically. I mean, you could. I would like to. The way I think of it is that they exist in a separate space than the universe. Like you can say that it's a real, like it's real in the sense that it exists apart from the universe, but it's not actually a part of the universe, and it's not like in the same way as a physical dimension or anything. That makes sense.
I was with you all the way up until the very last thing when you started positing like Platonic realism or something.
Not really. I don't really think it really exists, but you could like make the argument that it. I mean, it's definitely outside of human. It definitely exists outside of human minds. Um,
So I
by
think I
some.
actually have an explanation for why you have the intuition that you might like, but let's go to seed next.
Right. Well, I mean, um, it, the way I think about it is that things that we think exist, like a chair, for example, we don't like we don't actually have access to quote unquote what's really there. We have like this consistent experience composed of like a pattern of atoms, and even atoms aren't fundamental. We don't actually at no point did we ever have like the fundamental units, and even when we're getting close, we're not sure that they're fundamental. And so I think that like numbers and concepts like are heavily tied in to our perceptions of what's real, what isn't, and it would be like a strange distinction to just say they don't count, but the other things that we do experience that aren't like actually the real things do. Um, I also think that like the numbers and concepts like uh, they keep we do the work, right? We do maths, we do logical reasoning, and then we come up with conclusions, and then we see them play out each time, and it's not like a surprise or a coincidence. In some sense, like there are like rules that are actually there, but don't occupy physical space, but they are like restrictions in how the world works, I guess. Um, so I guess like if you imagine that the world is a simulation, then you have like the objects in the simulation, like where they are and what they look like, and then you have the rules that govern their interaction, and that's kind of where concepts and numbers are, I think. Uh, Not in like a platonic sense where real stuff is
Aristotelian
fake and like,
sense.
yeah, I think.
Because
I haven't
for
read enough of his
Aristotle,
works to know for
the
sure.
concepts are real, but they are in the object, whereas for Plato, the concepts are real, but they're somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, they are. I'm not 100% sure they are in the object because like when we figure out counting and like we can count coconuts, uh, it's not that like apples also coincidentally also have a similar property. It's somehow that that's the property that applies to things. Uh, yeah, I'm not sure how to put it better than that. So yeah, what's your view, Chris?
So my view is kind of that like everything is epiphenomena. So like so what we call numbers are based on a conception of like natural math of like mathematics that's like in turn kind of based on generalized observations we make about how discrete objects act. Like so my perspective is that you can say that like numbers or like mathematical laws or physical laws are real in the sense that like they like not okay so they're real in the sense that they're describing something that's real and affects things, but it's like it's not like that. So I think what's confusing to like most people when talking about like the ontology of mathematics is that um like okay so every name that we give I think that like okay so everything is names, right, that we're just giving to like patterns and epiphenomena that we see in our
I
experience.
have a question.
But
What's
I
an epiphenomena, and what's the difference between a phenomenon and an epiphenomena?
so an epiphenomena is so you know Conway's Game of Life.
Yes.
So an epiphenomena is like when you take Conway's Game of Life and construct it so that it plays Conway's Game of Life itself, like or does some other like self-maintaining like pattern. Like the actual thing that's operating is just the rules of Conway's Game of Life, but then you can use those to generate sort of a higher level pattern that's doing something else that's not like directly related to just the rules.
So you mean like an emergent phenomenon?
Yeah, pretty much. I like using epiphenomena better because like the at least the way in which I was introduced to the idea of like emergence is like sometimes it's used as like a magic wand. Um,
I've yeah, I don't actually. I think emergent phenomena is a better name than epiphenomena, but that's just personal opinion because people understand what they're talking about. I've never heard epiphenomena before.
the definition of epiphenomena is a secondary effect or byproduct that arises from but does not causally influence a process. So, for instance, in the case of mathematics, like we mathematics is an epiphenomena of how discrete like material objects operate because it's not like mathematics is something that like imposes its laws on reality like in the way that like a government imposes laws on people. Mathematics is just like a description of the behavior that emerges from how material things operate, if that makes sense.
I see.
So that's why I use epiphenomena as it's like the most exact word that I know of that directly corresponds to what I'm trying to say.
Yeah,
But I do take your point.
I realized that it has a Wikipedia page, so yeah, it's different from emergent phenomenon. My bad.
Yeah. Yeah, so okay, so what I'm trying to get is like okay, so all objects are just kind of epiphenomena of like how particles interact. And then mathematics is the description of the epiphenomena of like everything, right? So that's why I'm saying like everything is epiphenomena, and we just when we're talking about like objects or like naming things, we're just taking a specific like epiphenomena like pattern of like something and giving the name, right? However, I think and generally that's based on just what's practically convenient. Like that's why people have arguments over definitions. Because like sometimes you can categorize the same set of things in a bunch of different ways that like can contradict or overlap. And so you can have an argument about like how to categorize things. But like I do think though that the sense that you guys get that like mathematics is discovered and not completely invented is from the fact that sometimes there's only a couple useful ways to categorize things, if that makes sense. Like if I have, you know what I mean? Like so the sense of it being discovered is the fact that the useful ways of categorizing the behaviors of discrete material objects is pretty small. And so like it's more like you just look at it and kind of know the best way to categorize it. And that's sort of how you discover math. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yeah, I mean, like on the one hand, you can say that like mathematicians kind of decide on what their axioms are and how and like what the rules of the game are, and then
Yeah, and
they let it
there are
play out,
alternate
and it gets
forms of uh, yeah, like there are alternate forms of math and logic and arguments over what axioms you should have. Like that's the whole thing with like Bertrand Russell's Principia Mathematica. Um, So like that's why I'm saying like it seems pretty clear to me that mathematics is just categorization. It's just that usually there's not a lot of wiggle room. Oh, and the final thing I wanted to add that I almost forgotten, this is the most important part, um, is that like the reason I feel comfortable saying a book is real, but I feel less comfortable saying like mathematics is real, is because like a book like is a specific epiphenomena, right? Um, that like it's a concept, but it's a specific instantiation like of an or example of a concept. Whereas mathematics is a general like language that's used to describe um like like a bunch of epiphenomena. So in the same way, I wouldn't say like the concept of book is real because that's the class, but I can say a book is real because that's an object. I'm less comfortable saying the number three is real, but I'm more comfortable saying like these three things here are real. Like, and it's true that there are three things here. If does that make sense?
Yeah, although I don't. It depends on your definition of real. So
what about an organized set of pages or whatever the definition of book is?
An organized set of oh, like you're talking about like the definition of a book.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not really. So this is why I like talking about definitions in terms of like a bunch of properties that you assign like a point value to the degree that something has a property. And then if the point value adds up to more than like a certain threshold, you call thing something that like that name applies to something. Because I don't think that definitions are like set things where like everything in like this definition has all of the properties to the same degree and all of the same properties. Like there are blurry lines. So I'd probably say a book like one of the properties is like an ordered set of pages, and the pages have to have like rows and columns of letters on them, and it has to contain like information of some kind, and prose maybe, and stuff like that, and have an outer binding around the loose pages as well. um Like, and all of those would be properties that you could have more or less of, or something. I don't know.
Yeah, there's like a sliding scale of bookness.
Yeah. So like
Mhm.
my notebook is kind of like that. So it's kind of book-like, but then like it's not the most book-like thing that I can think of. Um, yeah. But yeah, oh, so you guys were asking my definition of real, and that sort of the thing is like in my estimation, the definition of real that like matters the most when we're trying to be like talk about and deal with the world and interact with other people, um, is like, something that I can, interact with, that can have some impact on like my senses, and is demonstrable in its existence to others.
Yeah,
Um,
in that case,
like,
I agree with you. Numbers are not real,
yeah,
but
but like specific numbers of things are real.
sure,
Because
yes,
it's like a class object distinction in like Java or
of
something.
course, yeah, but
Mhm.
even I agree with you. Numbers are not real. The only thing I do think that in this, like in the same sense, a possible world is unreal. Um, the number line is unreal in the same way. Like it's like there's something like common that is shared between like three carrots, three and three breadsticks, or like us thinking about the number three, or like 010. Sorry, 11 inside a computer, and so on. Right? There's something unifying,
Yeah,
something that all of these physical objects encode or represent. They all represent something that exists, not exist, it doesn't really, so we could maybe there's a different sense
they
of
all
existing.
okay. So the binary number and the concept. The binary number is a name for a concept, just as the actual physical letter three is or digit three is a name for the concept of three. And then the concept of three is a description of the common properties of things that we find useful, like to categorize as similar in that regard as
No,
having
there,
threeness.
I disagree with that. There is no concept of three that is shared by like three breadsticks in nature, or well, not in nature, but like there is no, like if no one sees the three breadsticks, there would be no concept. But I think that they still
No, I'm
encode.
I'm saying, but they share properties. So I think you're
Yes,
misunderstanding what I'm saying. Like what I'm saying is that like a name is meant to bring up an idea in someone's mind,
yes,
but the name isn't the idea.
yes,
And then
that
the
we're,
idea is a descript is has reference to like a group of properties on like a sliding scale. Um, and
yeah,
so they're like three different things.
gotcha. um
Yeah.
yeah, so I would say that that the that you can visualize this sliding scale in multiple ways. You can think of stuff like in multiple different ways, and all of these ways are equally unreal, because there's only one real universe, and then there's like in infinite different imaginary ways to think about it. Uh,
Yeah, I agree. Like that's yeah. That seems fine to me.
Yeah, so like some people have said the universe is actually a 2D hologram because of something called the holographic principle. Does that make our universe less real? No, our universe is still real, but it's just a different way to think about our universe. Um,
Yeah, yeah. Because we're still like interacting with and having to deal with our universe and able to demonstrate it to other people.
yeah, and in the same way, like numbers and like threeness is a different way to think about everything else. So it's not real. It doesn't exist in the real world, but there is like a coherent idea, I think, behind the like behind this abstraction anyway.
Well,
Um,
saying something isn't real in this sense, saying something isn't metaphysically real doesn't mean it's ontologically incoherent, if that makes sense.
that didn't make sense. Sorry.
Um,
I don't
okay, so
know.
when I
I don't
say
know what
number is
metaphysical means as an adjective in this case.
I'm when I mean okay, so like when I say a number isn't real, um, like because it's not like a metaphysical object that just kind of that like has independent existence or something like in a Platonic way. When I say it's not real in that sense, that doesn't mean that like the number three or whatever doesn't mean something that's useful and that like actually refers to something in reality. Um, does that help?
Not
Like, 'cause-
entirely.
I think so. Okay, so I think where like what you mean by this is like if you take like numbers in mathematics and like do like what Einstein did, where he played around with like Minkowski space and curved geometry, and then like discovered facts about the universe from like the properties of mathematics, like combining them together, and like he didn't know it before he went in, and even though like the math or I guess numbers aren't metaphysically real, they're still there's they're like abstractions of common properties. Even the properties and relations exist in some sense, or
yeah,
not as like separate, not like taking up separate space, but just
they
as
exist in the sense
relations.
that material things actually work this way, and that can have an effect on you. Um,
Mhm.
yeah,
I think the big reason why I think that I say that it exists independently of human minds is like if an alien discovered not yeah I would say discovered three or like counting, they would make the same conclusions as we did. So um
yeah. Well, so that's because the properties and relations that we are categorizing as threeness do exist for other alien races. And the way the properties and relations work. Remember, I said that like just because I'm a nominalist, like a pragmatic nominalist, doesn't mean that I don't recognize that there are more and less useful and sensible ways to categorize properties and relations. Right. So, like the reason an alien would discover three if it discovered counting, and we would be able to communicate in mathematics or whatever, is because the same properties and relations that we're seeing, it would see. And there's just not that many ways to usefully categorize those properties and relations. So it would almost definitely end up categorizing them the same way.
yeah
Just like, yeah,
I think we're actually honestly agreed because in the sense I'm a pragmatist, I think it doesn't really matter whether numbers are real or fake because you get the same result anyway. So
yeah,
yeah, I haven't actually given too much thought to this. I would actually say numbers like they don't. I think we're actually pretty much agreed. We just have different definitions of the word real.
yeah. I just, I'm trying to use a definition that like, if someone tells me that like the invisible, like clown that follows them around and says things to them is real. Like I want to be able to say like no, that's not real. um. So and if you didn't know, that's a reference to It by Stephen King, which I highly recommend, by the way. Um. But yeah,
Okay, so I'm kind of like to use an analogy from your favorite philosopher, Chris. I'm kind of like imagining that I'm in Plato's cave, right? And it's this big dark cave, and I can only see like the shadows of stuff. I can't see like all the stuff that's in there, so I don't have access to reality. What I do have access to, what my viewport does see, is all I can talk about. So I can't really think that much or talk that much about what is real outside of my point of view, out like elsewhere in the cave, um, where I can't see, and so I have to be like a pragmatist for what I can see, for what useful predictions that I can make,
yeah. This
and then
I actually recently learned a name for this. It's called phenomenological conservatism, which is basically like the idea that um like you kind of have to take like appearances seriously until you have like a reason not to, because like what else are you going to do? Like even when you have evidence that you shouldn't take an appearance seriously, that's based on other appearances. Like when you put a stick into the water and it appears bent, right? And then you take it out and it's straight, or you touch it and it seems straight through the water even though it looks bent. Like you're deciding that you shouldn't trust the appearance of the stick being bent because you have other appearances telling you that it isn't. So yeah,
It's nice to know the thing that I'm doing has a philosophical term for it.
yeah, all
Yeah, and
right,
so like for the word real to be useful, because what I think is really real is like the outside of my viewport, like the entire case. But because I can't ever like tell if something's there, then for the word to be useful and to apply to anything, I should apply it to the things. I should like apply it to the things that I experience and go, that's real and that's not real because that's there and that's not there.
yeah, yeah. So I would say something similar. So like the like from my perspective, I have to deal with the world as it presents itself to me, right? Right, the phenomena. I don't have access to the noumena. So the real things are just like the things that I have good evidence are actually like, real, you know, like just actually good descriptions of what's behind um the phenomena that present to me. Um because like you can posit a mechanism behind the phenomena, and those mechanisms that you posit can be more or less effective at predicting your experiences, and you basically do Bayesian reasoning. And then like I would also say that part of that is that real things, like if there is a common, okay, so if other people are just figments of my imagination, then like they're still, whether or not they are, I'm taking part in something that's common between me and them. Like that allows me to communicate with them and see them exist around me and stuff. So like if there is something external to me, like actual noumena, it's if something only appears to me, it's hard to tell whether it's part of the noumena or not. But if something appears to me and other people, that increases the chances that it is something that's like external to just like my mind. And so like that's just like more evidence for the Bayesian reasoning that something is like actually real, I guess. Um,
I think we're all agreed here.
Yeah, pretty
yeah,
much. I was just on Wikipedia reading about some stuff, so sorry if I was a little bit quiet.
that's fine. Did we have anything else we wanted to talk about?
Let me think of it that we had any
Uh,
recent arguments. Not arguments, discussions.
Oh yeah, I
Free
guess did
will.
we want to talk a little bit about free will?
Sure.
yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think that free will is fake.
Yeah, I mean I agree. I think that when people are describing free will, like I said in the comments, in the discussion channel, um, like I think that they're actually referring to something that is like they're referring to an experience that definitely happens and does mean something, which is the fact that like you actually have to go through the calculations of deciding something, because like otherwise it would be already decided. And so before you finish the calculations, you don't really know what the outcome is going to be. And so that's why you have a sense that it could be anything, right? That you could choose anything in essence. And then as you go through the calculations, you get like more and more convinced that only one option is viable. And so that's why it feels like it's sort of coming from you when you finally like stick on a decision. And so that's like the two experiences that people are describing when they say free will, which is just the sense that like I could have done anything, and then when I made the decision, it came from me, right? Like that's all I really think that free will is.
Yeah, and I think this actually people have this sense of not knowing or not having enough information implies that they have choices. A lot in other people too, because like let's say I gave this guy an offer, and I said, oh, he's free to choose, right? But let's say I weighted it heavily, or I knew he was going to do something like I'm giving a drug addict, hey, you want this heroin or you want this money? Um,
Mhm.
I would say he never even had a choice, right? And
Yeah.
I think this is intuitive. Like we intuitively know that if we know what someone's gonna do, they don't have any free will. It's just only when we don't know what they're gonna do, we think that they have free will. So I think people like intuitively associate like knowledge, foreknowledge about what someone's gonna do with the lack of free will about it. But if they don't know or like there's uncertainty, then they call it free will.
Yeah, and I think in a sense this is kind of valid reasoning because if you don't have evidence that if you don't have good evidence that they'll make a particular decision one way or another, then the decisions are like roughly going to be equally likely. And then the more evidence you have that they're going to make one decision over the others, then they're one obviously becomes more likely. So basically, what's happening here is they're confusing frequentist probability and Bayesian probability. So like what they're the probabilities that they're actually assessing is just the level of certainty that someone will make a choice. And so when you don't know what choice someone is going to make, you have an equal level of certainty for each choice and all that. But they're confused. That's what they're actually doing. But they're confusing it with frequentist probability, where like when you say that there's an equal probability, you don't mean you have an equal certainty that someone will make a choice. It's that like 50% of the
They'll do
time,
it half the time.
yeah, like if you rewound the universe. And so, since frequentist probability is based on multiple instances of something occurring, and the only way you could do that is for an individual to say it again. When they confuse Bayesian certainty-based probability with frequentist probability, that's what leads to people saying that free will means I could have done otherwise if the universe was rewound. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I understand what you're talking about.
Yeah,
Although,
that
yeah,
was way more verbose than I wish I could have made
yeah,
it. But
but I understood what you were talking about, like from like when you mentioned Bayesian and frequentist, because I was like, I see.
yeah, it's just people confuse Bayesian and frequentist probability all the time, and so if they're naturally doing Bayesian reasoning, right, with like the level of certainty that someone will make a choice, and then they accidentally convert it into frequentist. Well, frequentist probability has metaphysical implications, and if you apply those to an individual decision, suddenly you get the idea that if you rewound the universe, you might get a different decision, because that's basically what frequentist implies.
Yeah, but there's no
Um,
way to rewind the universe and get a different outcome, obviously.
yeah, so frequentist probability just isn't applicable here. And I think this goes into like what people generally don't understand about probability is that like frequentist probability works the way it does because it's not the exact same event turning out different outcomes. It's very similar events with slightly different inputs turning out vastly different outcomes. And so like if you had the same event, you'd get the same outcome every time. So like frequentist probability works because when you say event, you actually mean type of.
Yeah, it's kind of like coin flips. You know, if you flip a coin the exact same way, it's always going to land on heads or tails. But you know,
Yep.
if there are minor variations, minor input variations can result in either heads or tails, and yeah, so on.
Yeah, I've actually done this experiment for a while. One of the things that like I would do to keep my hands busy while I'm just like laying in bed with a headache or whatever is flip a giant silver coin. And I wish I had something other than Trump on it, but it's a giant silver Trump coin.
How do you get a
And
giant
I hate
silver
it.
Trump coin?
What did you say?
How did you get a giant silver Trump coin?
My anti-vaxxer flat earther grandfather sent it to me.
That is very excellent. I would love a silver. I already have like a plastic Trump 3D printed statuette until I donated it to someone else as a gift.
Actually, where is my coin? I know it's somewhere around here, but I seem to have lost track of it. It'll show up eventually. It's probably worth quite a bit, but um, I lost it because
Yeah, just
yeah,
wait till like Trump becomes the first president, first ex-president to like get assassinated or something, or like something else happens, and then it'll be like a classic.
yeah. Anyway, what I was gonna say is I would flip it, and one of the things I noticed is that like if I flip it similarly every time, like like it's more likely to end up giving me the same output, like heads or tails or whatever. So
Yep.
yeah,
So we're all in agreement that free will never existed.
yeah, pretty much. I did
Yeah,
want
I
to
mean,
ask
I
one.
don't think it could exist. Like it sounds like the mechanism you'd need to support it doesn't make sense. You'd need like an infinite regress. You either have determinism or you have randomness, or you have self-causation. And then like so you're choosing to make yourself choose something, and you have to keep doing that, otherwise it like comes to you.
Schopenhauer is very proud of you.
But not Nietzsche.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, I did want to add that I think one. So the internally, I think the two properties that I described definitely encapsulate what people mean by like the feeling of free will. But I think the other thing is that like externally, when people are talking about free will, um, they're talking also about like how much like okay, so how much unpredictability or like entropy in this is generated within the person's brain from inputs to outputs. So like you have like a pseudo random number generator, and sometimes the outputs are like there's more or less processing between the seed and the output, and it's more or less like predictable because of that. Um, I think that like when people are saying that someone else had free will, like Gavin was saying, it's basically based on like how predictable, given the inputs, was their action. Um, so it's basically like another form of like Bayesian probability, where like if they didn't know beforehand, but I like yeah. So I guess this is just
I think it
rewriting it
refers
down.
to not being coerced or like being like when people use it, like oftentimes, like as someone saying, "I'm writing this will of I'm writing this legal document of my own free will." I think what we really mean is like I'm not crazy. I'm able to use reason, and no one put a gun to my head to do this.
Well, so that I'm trying to get there. Just give me a second. So the analogy that I would use is like first the most extreme case is like mind control, where the input is like a remote and the output is the person doing something. That input output is incredibly predictable, very one to one, and like not confusing at all. And so it's like 100% Bayesian certainty that like if you push the sit down button on the remote, the mind control person will sit down or whatever. And so you'd obviously say that like the mind controlled person doesn't have free will. Um, and like with coercion, basically what's happening is what someone is describing is like if you don't have a gun to someone's head and you suggest that someone does something, there's a range of possible things that they could do, and one isn't like way significantly more probable than any of the others. Like one might be more probable because it's like more reasonable or more beneficial to them or something, but like you don't know, like you don't have like 99% certainty. But if you put a gun to someone's head and tell them to do the same thing, suddenly the probability space of what they do looks very different, and your Bayesian certainty that they'll do what the person asks gets really close to 100%. And so this goes back to like free will just referring to how like certain you are that someone will do a certain action. Does that seem valid?
Yeah, I agree with it.
Like, and
I
this is
mean,
why
my intuitive problem with that is like, what if someone's character is like more risk averse than the average person? So you have like high predictability that they'll avoid a risk if it presents itself. And
but there are many
yeah,
other
basically
that's
that's
like a
that.
negative thing. That's taking out an option, but like there are a bunch of other options. And so generally like the probability space is less dominated by one particular choice. It's just one particular choice drops out almost entirely. Like there's a little bit of difference between that. And that's why like so in the case of um like if someone's hanging by their fingernails off the edge of a cliff, right? And you're like, you know, if you say, you know, uh, praise be to God or something like that, I'll haul you up. Um, like someone would probably say that's pretty coercive because like the problem space or the set of like the probability space of actions that that person would do at that given time becomes just massively like way more than normal dominated by one thing, right? And it's definitely not the person saying fuck off. Um, Whereas, like, if someone's really risk averse and you're asking them to do something, the probability space of what they'll actually do probably doesn't include whatever you're asking them to do that's risky, right? But there's still like a lot of other like the it's not dominated by one thing. Um, yeah,
And yeah, to get back to your initial example of like the person who's risk averse, my take is we all have the same amount of free will, which is zero. But like the risk averse guy will have less apparent free will to other people because his actions
yeah,
are more predictable.
yeah. All we're trying to describe here is
Apparent free
what
will. Yeah.
people's intuitions about free will are actually referring to.
Yeah.
Because
Right.
So,
like
oh, go on.
phenomenological conservatism actually applies here because, or at least like a form of doing proper phenomenology. Because like if you're a good phenomenologist, you're not going to say no, you don't have that experience to somebody just because it's like kind of what they say is causing the experience is incoherent, right? You're going to say you would say yes, perhaps you're having that experience, but the metaphysical thing that you're positing that's causing it doesn't make sense. So let's try to figure something else out, which is sort of what I'm trying to do here.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, what are you guys' opinions on how this lack of free will relates to punishment? Should we still punish the same way? Does
Um,
punitive punishment make sense?
I might disagree with Chris slightly here in that there are certain ideas of punishment that are like bolstered by the belief in free will that kind of become incoherent if you disbelieve in free will, but then there are things that you care about that you can increase the chances of getting if you have punishments for certain behaviors. So yeah, like punishment as like a deterrent or still makes sense or as a way but like punishment in the like free will believer sense where it's like you're evil, you chose to be evil, you deserve punishment, and like it should be cruel because what you did was extra cruel and like not for the sake of deterrent doesn't make sense if you don't believe in free will. That's my
yeah, so
take on it.
that's similar to my point of view, where like I think that it's not really like from a just sort of like you guys know how my moral system with regard to justice works. It's sort of about like what you can rationally do to people. It's not about like why they chose to do what they did. And like I would say that the purpose of like the saying that like you can apply someone's own maxim back on them is not like I'm not saying that because I want everyone to do that in all cases. Like the fact that
That's like the
theoretically,
upper limit of what you can do to them.
yeah, it's the absolute upper limit, and I would say that there's rarely ever a reason to actually go to that upper limit, even though like theoretically you could and would probably like feel justified afterwards. Like most of the time, what you're actually going to want to do is like you care about your well-being, you care about the people you like, you care about your friends and family and whatever, and overall society. So just decide how you want to punish them based on that, if at all.
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, I'm personally on the side of we should only punish as a deterrent or like to rehabilitate or to just keep them away from other people who they could potentially harm. Um,
Yeah,
I don't. I
like
think punitive punishment, like just like as revenge, doesn't really make sense and in fact, it should be avoided from a utilitarian standpoint.
Yeah, from my standpoint, like like retributive punishment is obviously possible, but it's almost definitely not like the best choice to make. Um, I would say that I'm not a huge fan of deterrence because that can you can use that to justify like punishing innocent people. I would say that restitution, prevention, or rehabilitation are like the top of my list. You know, in that
I
order.
think it's consequentialism with side constraints. If you can, if it's known that if you violate someone in some way, that you do get like a proportionate punishment, like beforehand, then that is deterrent, and that doesn't like violate innocent people.
Yeah, but like you could
It'd probably be a more effective deterrent in that case, even like if you're like, oh,
you
it makes no
well, I mean,
difference if I beat people up.
you can really effectively deter people by like grabbing a random person off the street, being like, you know, framing them for some heinous crime, and then like flaying them to death on live TV. Like that's really effective.
Actually, I think there are several studies that have shown that deterrence doesn't really increase after 20 years of prison time. Punishments that exceed that tend to have the same effect because people are already like, it's bad enough. People who still do it don't think they're going to get caught, basically.
Okay, so but that still doesn't mean that like we can't use innocent people for a deterrent.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
in general, it's a kind of bad. I'm not a fan of deterrence either, but I'm just like hypothetically, if it actually worked, then that would be another reason. But
yeah, yeah, sure.
Yeah,
But I'm just explaining why like okay, so I don't like deterrence because I don't think it's that effective because no, if you're doing a crime, it's because you don't think it's gonna be you're gonna be caught, like you said, and I don't like rehabilitation because that's a really that seems really frightening to me, and here's why. There was actually a study that was done where a bunch of people went into a mental institution. They were like written down as psychopaths and sent in, and their job was to try to
all right.
convince the people, the staff, you know, because they're being held in padded cells and everything, and they have to. They're actually not psychopaths. They have to
We're
convince the staff that
researchers.
they're not. Yeah, they're just regular researchers and like people with families and stuff, and they actually weren't able to do it. And the rest of the researchers had to call off the experiment and go in to rescue them.
yeah,
Because they
I think that's a problem with like our current psychiatric system, but it's not an inherent problem with rehabilitation in of it itself. Because I think we know that most criminals aren't mentally ill. Most of them are just like don't have money or were brought up like inside a situation where they had a lot of criminal like friends or family members and they got dragged into it, etc. So I would say
yeah, I see what you mean, and I in general I agree, but I think that the specific problem with rehabilitation that I was trying to get at with that example is that like with rehabilitation, you're not done until some expert says you're done. On the basis of not like a set like amount that's just like encoded in rules or proportionate to what you did. It's completely arbitrary based on what they think your psychological state is.
oh I see what you
So
mean. Yeah,
so and like that's kind of scary because like while I think that psychology and neurology and stuff are important and interesting fields, like that stuff's really hard to do like consistently well.
yeah, I agree with you, but I was just talking about like guiding principles, not necessarily like what must be done in every case. For like stuff like
Well, what I mean is like because of the problems with the very idea of rehabilitation, we should actually shy away from it almost as much as like uh, deterrence. Maybe not as much as retribution, but like it should not be in a list of guiding principles.
the problems that you point out weren't inherent to rehabilitation. They were only inherent to some implementations of rehabilitation.
Well, I think his point was because there's no criteria that is like objective, that any implementation is likely to result in basically someone's opinion.
No, I mean like it doesn't necessarily have to be like you are not allowed to leave until a psychiatrist okays you. It could just be like
Oh yeah, you can
while
go
you're in
like one
prison.
year rehabilitation or something.
yeah, while you're in prison, we teach you how to get like a job somewhere else. Like let's say you're stealing because you're unemployed and you're like stealing food and selling it, or like stealing TVs and selling them on the black market or something. So if that's a problem, then if you have like a job, then you're less likely to steal because you've got a better way of doing it. Same way as like how like as soon as Netflix happened, piracy went down.
Fair enough. Yeah, that kind of yeah. So I guess if we're talking
Yeah,
about
I'm just fine with that
rehabilitation
too.
that's like mental illness based, I would say no, run away. But if we're just talking about like training people in trades and trying to prevent the situation that led them to crime in the first place, that's fair.
Yeah, I mean it's a guiding
Um,
principle. It's not always implemented in the same way that you're locked inside like a padded room and you can't escape till like you pass some arbitrary psychological test that makes no sense. That'd be like
Yeah, I think the idea is like locking someone away forever or like killing them, whatever, is like worse than trying to make it so that they can get along peacefully. Like
yeah, because
that's what you should look for first after someone's committed a crime.
yeah, and I think actually if we're going to talk about like the criminal system, like one of the things that occurs to me is that like the stigma and like okay, so I read a story of like a criminal where they said that like they were in prison for like 10 years, so they got rusty in all of their skills and it's all out of date. And they basically just get dumped off on the corner of like somewhere in Austin, Texas with like $5 to buy a bus ticket and that's it. Like what are they supposed to do now? Like crime.
Right. Yeah,
So
no one hires an ex-con. Well, almost no one. Well, at least nothing enough to like suppose they're supporting a family or whatever it is that like led them into crime in the first place. They won't be able to get a job, a legitimate job that doesn't, uh, yeah, that satisfies those uh, issues.
yeah, this is why like I don't know. Yeah. So yeah, that's sort of a problem with our system. Is it's like the more crime you do, the more likely you are to do crime because like the worse off you get, and there's not really a good way to claw yourself back up. I
Right. Yeah.
don't really.
Most offenders are repeat offenders.
Yeah. So and the way you fix that is by teaching people useful skills in jail, and well, maybe trying to get rid of some of the stigma or something. I don't know, but
yeah, I kind of agree.
Yeah, and I think maybe that comes partially from beliefs in free will because if you didn't believe in it, then the main thing that you'll look for in a justice system is A, how do you make sure without violating rights that like violations of rights don't happen that often? And then when they do, how can you be restored to the extent that you could, right? Like if
yeah.
someone
Well,
robs
that's
you,
the
how
other
can
thing.
you
It's like
get that money
that's
back?
why restitution is at the top of my list of like principle for dealing with crime because like if you don't restitute the people that were wronged, they're not going to be made happier by like rehabilitating or punishing the criminal, like not that much anyway. Like if you ask families that have been wronged by a criminal, like before they'll say like, oh yeah, we want him punished, and then afterwards it's like, well, that wasn't actually as satisfying as I expected. um and same thing for like rehabilitation too. It's like, yeah, great, like the person that raped my wife is now happy, with a job or whatever. Like that's, great. um like
And I paid for it with my taxes.
exactly. So like that's why I think even if you're a utilitarian, restitution should be at the top of your list. Because like in a lot of cases, if you try like preventing like dealing with the criminal is better for society, but trying to restitute the victims will directly undo part of the detriment to the overall happiness that the criminal did in the first place.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Um,
It should be necessary for stuff like petty theft. But I don't know how to get around it with like stuff like murder or rape or that kind of stuff. But for like things like theft and fraud, it's definitely like something that should be there.
Yeah, for sure. Because like if you have restitution, then the detriment to the overall happiness of society of a crime happening is less because do restitution for it.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so I'm gonna voice something that I'm really not sure about, have really mixed feelings on, and is gonna be really controversial. What so what do you guys think about like the idea of like indentured servitude, right? So like instead of going to jail, you work a trade, you know, for like some, and then like the money that you make partially goes to you to keep you fed and clothed and whatever, and then the rest of that money like goes to um restitution for the victims. Because it occurs to me that like that system, it accounts for restitution without taxing the victims that are being restituted. It'll teach the criminal um, a skill. The criminals now support themselves instead of being supported by taxpayers, and it might be possible for a criminal that's working a job like that to actually save up money that they might have to start with on the outside. Um, you know, if there's leeway between the amount that they have to pay for the restitution and the amount that they have to just support themselves, and then what they're actually paid. Like I don't know. It seems like it would be a good idea, but at the same time, it's kind of like slavery, and that's dubious.
I actually, as
Yeah,
long as
I can
it's,
also imagine. Oh wait, go on.
well, I was just gonna say, as long as it's implemented inside a fair and non-corrupt manner, I don't think there are any like theoretical or moral problems I have with it. It's just like in practice, when you give the government an incentive to like enslave people, not enslave, but like force people to serve for longer, then they're more likely to want people to serve for longer. If that makes sense.
Yeah, this is why it occurs to me that this would only work if the victims got to decide the amount of restitution. Well, okay, so here's the deal. Like, yeah, the amount of restitution that they want or something like. So where like if you actually ask the victims like what they want the verdict to be, and you don't have to do exactly what they say, but maybe that would be a good counterbalance. The other thing is that like none of this money is ultimately supposed to go to the government at all. Like, so the government isn't really actually directly benefiting from the work that these prisoners are doing, because like the money is just supposed to go to the prisoner, the victims, or like to the prisoner's upkeep. Like none of that's actually supposed to be profiting the government. So
I mean, yeah, if you could pull it off without like giving the government an incentive to imprison people for longer, it seems like a reasonable idea to me.
yeah, yeah, it's always for every suggestion that you make, it's always corruption that's always like going to be the problem.
Yeah,
Um,
pretty much.
yeah,
Yeah, but I think one of the things you could probably do is all the money has to go directly either to like the victim or like the criminal. And if you do that, then
yeah.
they have less of an incentive to pull shenanigans.
Yeah, and maybe the criminal and the victims have to agree with each other. So maybe what it is that if the victim and the criminal and the victims have to agree on how much they're going to get in restitution and over what time period, and if they can't agree, the victims don't get restitution and the criminal just goes to jail. So they have an incentive to hammer something out, um and but they can work it out in the individual case, so that like if the criminal can get them to do like a long enough time frame, the criminal will be able to save up like for their own um like welfare afterwards as well and stuff, so that I don't know, does that
Yeah, I think that seems fair.
yeah
Right, and it would indicate that like the criminal took active efforts to restitute their victim, so you could be like more confident than someone that was just released from prison, but like they had to be there and they didn't have an option to escape and they didn't take as many active efforts. You can be more assured that like you have more evidence that they actually like set
gave up on
themselves on the
acting.
right path afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, because like if they just choose to go to jail, like that's an indication that they don't think what they did was wrong and they're not willing to cooperate. Um, and so like jail isn't necessarily going to change that. But if they're actually working to make restitution. They were able to come to an agreement. That means they had to give a little bit, right? Because they have to agree with their victims. So like that sort of indicates that maybe they're more reasonable. Yeah. So I don't know.
I mean,
Um,
I agree with it like in principle, I think, but it sounds like you'd have to really get like the edge cases right and the implementation because it seems like the kind of thing where you can get like horrific outcomes where like
Gulag
the
time.
professor
Allegedly, this is what China is claiming to do inside like Xinjiang with re-education camps. So
yeah, but like the problem with like China, like the gulags and the re-education camps, is that it's just the government arbitrarily deciding how much work it wants from them, and so obviously it's gonna choose like huge amounts of work,
yeah,
and
pretty
also
much.
none of the money is going to the workers themselves. It's
Yeah,
all
that's
going to the government.
so.
So
Yeah,
like if we set this up so that the money wasn't even filtered through the government, it went directly to the bank account of the victims or the bank account of the criminal. So like the government had lawyers set it up for the victim and the criminal, but like none of the bank accounts involved once set up were in the government's control. Like lawfully anyway. Um, and it had to be based on like the criminal and the victim agreeing. Um, where they both have an incentive to agree because the victims want the restitution, the criminal doesn't want to have the government force him to go to jail instead. Like that, I think would fix all of the negative incentives that I can think of. But you know,
yeah. I think it's a decent idea.
yeah. Although I'm just imagining a horrific situation where they for bullshit so-called crimes against society but don't actually have any victims like drug dealing or whatever, where they're
Oh
like,
yeah,
oh, now you have to pay society, and government is society, don't you know?
you have to
oh
make sure
dear.
that this doesn't get implemented for piracy. Otherwise, it's going to be actually terrible. Like,
Yeah.
imagine having to like work to pay off some
Shine, Johnny Depp,
MGM or
please.
whoever.
I have to work for Disney because I pirated Avengers Endgame.
Right, giant mouse whipping you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so this is why I think that this would only work in like a society that was extremely libertarian, that basically only had tort-like crimes where like it's crimes against another person. Because otherwise,
Allegedly,
yeah.
piracy is a crime against another person.
Uh,
I personally don't believe in intellectual property, but then again, if hypothetically,
yeah, I'm not sure that actually is a crime against another person because you're only hurting them in the sense that you are causing other people to voluntarily choose not to pay them. So by the same token, like giving a bad review of them would be hurting them in the exact same way. Because like when you pirate, you're not like deleting the movie off of Disney servers. Like that would be an actual crime, but like
yeah,
piracy is just copying.
Well, yeah, I think it depends how you do the piracy. If you're like a recipient, then not you're not really doing anything to them. But if you're like the original pirater who has to have like some kind of access to the system and then use it like let's say you're in the cinema and you're recording secretly and you're doing something that they said not to do with their property and like taking up space there and whatever and
Oh,
violating
yeah,
their
fair enough. Like if you
consent.
sign a contract that says that you're not allowed to pirate, then yeah, like whatever were put in the contract can be under effect. But like in my view of contracts, you have to have a mutual consideration. And so it's like the only way, and it is based on title transfer. So it would be very hard to do that because um, like yeah. So basically, like the reason it would be difficult is I'm trying to think of like a good way to explain this that's not overly verbose. Um, I guess so. The thing is that like when you violate a contract, the only thing that can happen to you is that you have to give back whatever the other person gave you. on because they gave it to you on the condition that you fulfilled the contract. So that like if you go into the theater and violate the terms on which they let you into the theater, the only thing that they can really like if you
I think I understand
like
what you're trying to say, right? Like,
the,
go
like
on.
if you sign a waiver saying that if you violate so by default if you violate the terms on which they let you into the theater, the only thing they can do is kick you out of the theater. If they make you sign a terms of service when you're entering the theater that says like, I'll pay you $50 if I violate these terms of service, like then like they can take $50 from you. Um,
Can they remove the recording that you make,
no,
or do they have
that's
to
what I'm saying.
explicitly say that? So okay, so they have to say that in the contract. Like, if you violate this, you have to pay us this and return any recording.
Yeah. Um, yeah. That's or like well, I guess yeah, I guess that would but you can't like directly transfer ownership of a recording, but you can temporarily transfer ownership of the thing that holds the recording, and then they can delete the recording from it. So
Yeah, okay, that sounds fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. The only thing that it probably wouldn't work is once it does get pirated, there's it's gonna spread around the internet pretty quickly because people who download from like say Pirate Bay, they didn't sign any
they're not
contract or
sensitive.
anything. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, but that's where I was saying it's like I don't actually think that like downloading a pirated copy is actually a crime against anyone.
To be honest, I
Um,
kind of agree. I kind of think that even inside our modern society, like currently as it is now, a lot of people pirate, and I think most movie companies are still making a profit. So
yeah,
probably
well, see,
okay.
that's the thing is that so we have this experiment already where like most people are willing to pay for things that they like because they know that that means that the company will make more of it. Um, uh, so like the
Right,
only
and
thing that
generally
people,
pirated copies are shittier.
yeah, exactly. And so the only time that people are really pirating is one if they actually aren't sure that they like whatever it is, and it's just the entrance bar is too high to buy it if you don't know if you like it. That's why a lot of piracy is happening to the comics industry as it goes down into the toilet. And then the other case where you have a lot of piracy is when it's just not accessible where you are. That's why piracy is a gigantic problem for anime, for instance. Um, but
That
yeah,
and like all of these stupid streaming services that make you buy a huge subscription just to get what you watch off of them. Like, let's say I only want to watch one. Let's say I only want HBO for Game of Thrones. It's totally nuts to pay like however much, like $30 a month for like however much it is for that one
yeah,
show and so
yeah,
on.
exactly. Like, um, that I mean, that's why I think it's that I actually think that's a good thing. In this case, because specifically because this is exactly what's incentivizing, for instance, Amazon Prime to go out of its way to create like really good shows. Like The Expanse and The Wheel of Time and the really high budget new Lord of the Rings. Like they might not be right that these will be good shows, but like Expanse is amazing. The Lord of the Rings shows might be bad, but the Wheel of Time show looks like it's going to be pretty good. So like, because they know that people are not going to buy into their subscription service for one thing, it incentivizes them to make a whole bunch of really big, awesome things.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's pretty much it on what I think about free will as well. I think I might go
Yeah.
eat now. I think we
Yeah,
pretty much agree on most stuff.
this was actually a really good conversation though, because we covered nominalism, free will,
A little bit
criminal
of
reform,
piracy,
and
so
then
on.
piracy, intellectual
Intellectual
property.
property.
Yeah, this was actually probably our best. I'll post this episode first once, Gavin, if you send me the recording.
Yeah, I'll probably
So
get back to you after lunch and I'll start uploading it. All right.
awesome, yeah.
See you
All
guys.
right.